China's growing global influence is no secret, and one of the ways it has achieved this is through its business dealings in Africa. China's engagement with Africa is becoming increasingly important, and its trade relations with African countries have expanded rapidly over the past few decades. In this video, we will explore how China is growing its global influence by doing business in Africa. We will discuss the history of China-Africa trade relations, the benefits of China-Africa economic relations, China's approach to doing business in Africa, criticisms of China's involvement in Africa, and the future of China-Africa economic relations. The history of China-Africa trade relationship. China's entry into Africa began in the 1950s with the establishment of diplomatic relations with Egypt, Sudan, and other countries. However, it was not until the late 1990s that China's trade relationship with Africa began to take off. Since then, China-Africa trade relations have grown rapidly, and China is now Africa's largest trading partner. China's trade with Africa has expanded from just $10 billion in 2000 to over $200 billion in 2020. This growth has been driven by China's increasing demand for African resources, such as oil, minerals, and timber, as well as its exports of manufactured goods to African countries. The benefits of China-Africa economic relations. China-Africa economic relations have several benefits for both parties. For African countries, China's investments in infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and ports, have helped to improve connectivity and reduce transportation costs. This has made it easier for African countries to trade with each other and with China. China has also invested heavily in Africa's energy sector, building power plants and transmission lines to help meet the continent's growing demand for electricity. For China, Africa represents a significant source of natural resources, such as oil and minerals, that it needs to fuel its economic growth. African countries are also important markets for Chinese manufactured goods, such as electronics and machinery. Overall, the China-Africa economic relationship has been mutually beneficial, with China gaining access to African resources and markets. China's approach to doing business in Africa. China's approach to doing business in Africa is characterized by investments in infrastructure and a focus on resource extraction. China has invested heavily in infrastructure projects such as railways, highways, ports, and airports, which have helped to improve connectivity and reduce transportation costs. China has also built power plants and transmission lines to help meet Africa's growing demand for electricity. These investments have helped to boost economic growth in many African countries and create jobs. China's focus on resource extraction has led to concerns about the impact on the environment and local communities. China is the largest importer of African oil and has invested heavily in mining and logging operations in Africa. This has led to concerns about environmental degradation, including deforestation and water pollution. Criticisms of China's involvement in Africa. China's involvement in Africa has also been criticized for its debt trap diplomacy, which involves offering loans to African countries for infrastructure projects that they may struggle to repay. This has led to concerns that China is using debt as a means of gaining leverage and control over African countries. In addition, China's reliance on African resources has raised concerns about resource depletion and its impact on African countries. Some argue that China's extraction of African resources is contributing to a resource curse in which countries become overly dependent on resource extraction and fail to diversify their economies. There are also concerns about the impact of China's involvement on African labor markets. Some argue that China's investment in infrastructure and manufacturing has led to the displacement of local workers and the importation of Chinese labor. China's growing global influence is in part due to its increasing engagement with Africa. China's trade relationship with Africa has expanded rapidly over the past few decades, driven by China's increasing demand for African resources and its exports of manufactured goods to African countries. The China-Africa economic relationship has several benefits, including increased investment, infrastructure development, and job creation. However, there are also concerns about China's approach to doing business in Africa, including its focus on resource extraction, debt trap diplomacy, and impact on the environment and local communities. As China's influence in Africa continues to grow, it is important to consider the potential implications for African countries and the global economy as a whole.